Well, we've been talking about EC Comics, and there's a reason that we've been talking about that one company so much, a reason that, if it hasn't already, will continue to be made clear. So, one of the things that EC Comics is known for is the humor comic book Mad, that would become Mad Magazine by Harvey Kurtzman. And yes, I pronounced it right, Kurtzman. See, he's telling me himself right there. Anyway, so that is probably the EC legacy. Well, not probably, definitely. That is the legacy of EC Comics that endured the longest. But even that is not what people think of immediately when they think of EC Comics. People who know about the history of comics, that is. There's a couple of other things. One primarily comes to mind, and that is the horror comics put out by EC as part of the new trend that Kurtzman and Al Feldstein, the sort of the two editors of the company, led the company toward, as well as also the more intense crime comics, particularly crime suspense stories and shock suspense stories. Both the horror and the crime particularly known for their extreme, really over-the-top violence, to the point of gore and kind of a sensationalized ferocity, barbarity, one might almost say, as you can see in the covers. Now, EC was not the only company putting out horror comics at this time, nor were they the first company to have done so. Feldstein and Kurtzman, remember, had seen a new trend coming, but they didn't totally prognosticate that. It was already starting. Okay, so as we've previously discussed, in 1947, Avon Comics put out Eerie, which was the first horror comic that was all horror. You know, you could argue that the Heap was a horror character, but he was a backup story. So this is the first comic that was all horror. But it was a one-shot. It was only, a one-time deal. The following year, American Comics started publishing Adventures into the Unknown, which was the first ongoing horror comic monthly that would run for almost 20 years. Now, we've talked about how the superhero genre that really ushered in the extreme popularity of comic books kind of started to fade at the end of World War II and was becoming an endangered species by 1950, giving way to new trends. Well, that was demonstrated over at Timely when the Submariner, issue 31, April 1949, featured the final appearance in that book by the Submariner, Prince Namor, little less than 10 years after he had first appeared in Marvel Comics number 1. The next month, with issue 32, the name of the book was changed to Amazing Mysteries. And the stories appearing there would gradually, well, not gradually, they would start off as horror. There's a big monster there, and that's kind of the theme they're going to follow for a while. Then, the month after Amazing Mysteries sort of was birthed from the pages of the Submariner, Marvel Mystery Comics, which featured regularly and had featured regularly for right at 10 years, the Human Torch, featured the last original Human Torch story in what was left of the twilight of the Golden Age. Oddly enough, ironically, It was a reprinting of the very first Human Torch story, which was the lead story in Marvel Comics #1 in 1939. So the Human Torch appears there, kind of in sort of a reprinting. Following month, the title is changed from Marvel Mystery Comics to Marvel Tales. No Human Torch in sight. Instead, the Ghoul strikes. And the month after that, July 1949, yes, even Captain America. Issue 73 was the last full Captain America issue of Captain America, which ironically was entitled The Outcast of Time, considering what the future would hold for Captain America. And the following issue, which didn't come out until October, was titled Captain America's Weird Tales, with Captain America in very small print. There was a Captain America story in it, in which he once again faced off against the Red Skull, who is kind of scarier looking than normal right here. That was the lead story, but all the backup stories were horror. And then, the issue after that, it was still called Captain America's Weird Tales, but it was just all weird tales. There was no Captain America at all to be seen. And after that issue, it was just canceled. So they actually did bring Captain America back, or they tried to, toward the end of the Korean War, about 3 years after this, 3 or 4 years after this. And it had, it just didn't fit in that time period. It only lasted 3 issues. Captain America fighting communists wasn't as appealing as Captain America fighting Nazis during the time people were actually fighting Nazis. So no, EC were not the only ones making horror comics, or crime comics for that matter, in the early 1950s. But they were the only ones doing either of those things the EC way, in the EC style. And what that means is they were doing them the freakiest, and they were doing them the best. So yes, EC murder victims might well have their intestines turned into sausages. Or they might have a decayed corpse to grab them and have their soft, slimy face touch them, and sightless eyes stare as they say, "I'll never let you go, John." So there's partly a series of morality plays in place here, kind of, sort of, because like in both of those cases, the person who gets their just desserts at the end is well deserving of it. So a lot of times what happens is that some innocent person is callously and cruelly murdered, and then returns from beyond the grave to wreak vengeance. Or sometimes it's just freaky stuff happening. Like, I don't know, eating an arm, beating someone to death with a poker, finding bodies in various stages of decay with their throats slit, and so on and so forth. So, extreme over-the-top violence. Another thing that kind of set EC apart was they had hosts to the stories who were telling you the story, like the Crypt Keeper from Tales from the Crypt, and the Vault Keeper from the other, Tales from the Vault, Horrors of the Vault, whatever the heck it was. Tales from the Crypt is the one that sticks out in most people's minds. So you've got the malefactor usually coming to a horrible, horrible end, and then the host, Crypt Keeper or whomever, pops out and makes some horribly bad puns. You know, doesn't that top all, kiddies? Let's see. He's a regular deadhead. Ha ha ha. Dig you later. Here's the vault keeper. Or in this case, I'll just give you a moment to read this for yourself. But if you're familiar with the HBO series that was made from Tales from the Crypt, gosh, I guess it's been 30 years ago now. So the early 90s. They had kind of an animatronic puppet version of the Crypt Keeper who would do the mad cackling and tell the really bad jokes. It was all part of the EC ambiance. So that's primarily what EC was known for at the time, and primarily what they're still known for. But they're known for something else too. They're known for the extremely, extremely high quality of the writing in the non-horror stories, even some of the crime stories. So we're talking about some of the various historical pieces that appeared in Two-Fisted Tales, some of the war comics, particularly from Frontline Combat, most of which were written by Harvey Kurtzman. And we'll talk about some of those stories in detail when we talk about the war comic genre. But I will tell you at this point that Harvey Kurtzman's approach to telling stories about war was unlike anything that had appeared in comics before. It was very realistic. It was not the sort of just blind, patriotic, jingoistic stuff that you found during World War II or during the Korean War in other companies' war comics. There was a lot of perspective of the enemy soldiers and of civilians on the other side that really pointed toward the horrors of war as opposed to the romanticizing of it. Some of the other stories that were really powerful that came from EC appeared in their science fiction and fantasy comics, and we'll be talking about one of those in particular a little further down the line. And some of the crime stories that appeared, especially in shock suspense stories, most of which were written by Al Feldstein. And it was kind of a similar thing to what I was talking about with Kurtzman's war stories. It really examined shades of gray and complexities behind some of the things going on in the world at that time. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you a brief overview of 3 separate stories written by Al Feldstein and appearing in shock suspense stories, all 3 of them in 1952. Now, the stories that I wound up settling on weren't even the ones I was originally thinking about. I had 3 or 4 in mind, and I found one of them, and then I was looking for the others, and I kept finding such interesting stories that fit in with this theme before I even got to the ones I was looking for. So these are 3 samples, but there are a lot of others. So you will notice, by the way, that the first 2 have a cover price of 10 cents. The third one, $1.50 or $1.25 in Canada. That's because that cover on the third one is a reprint from the early 1990s. And there's a reason that I went with the reprint on that one that I'll explain when I get there. All right, well, let's jump in. First, from issue 6, a story written by Al Feldstein and illustrated by Wally Wood, who also did the cover. In fact, if you look down on the lower left-hand corner, you can just make out his signature. Undercover. And as you can tell, it deals with some Ku Klux Klan-like individuals. Now, it's not specified as the Klan. In fact, they give them another name, but it's clearly supposed to be talking about the Ku Klux Klan. And what's going on as the story opens is that this young woman has been abducted and has been tied up and is being told by these hooded people, you need a lesson and you're going to get it. We're going to teach you not to fool around with them. You're going to get the whipping of your life, Susie Carson. The them that is implied is that she has been romantically involved with someone that the guys in hoods don't approve of. So, you don't have to read between the lines too much to figure out what's going on there. By the way, as the story progresses, you will understand that the title Undercover has several layers of meaning. All right, so here comes the guy that is sort of the grand dragon, the leader, who says, hitch her to the tree and give me the whip, the Grand Master. And says, Susie Carson for consorting with that trash element in our town. The Black Vigilante Society sentences you to 100 lashes. This will teach you to stay with your own kind. And the whipping begins. Here's where we find out what that undercover title means. There's a reporter named Sam, who has kind of like gone undercover with these guys and snuck out there so he can see what they're up to, and he's now hiding and watching from the bushes, from behind the cover of the bushes and the trees, witnessing what's happening. And what he witnesses is they beat the girl to death. And when her lifeless body slides to the ground, the leader, the Grand Master, takes off his hood to listen to the girl's heart to determine that, yes, she is dead. And, let's get out of here. Now, Sam, the reporter, had been wanting to investigate. There had been several whippings in the town of young women who had been consorting with the sort of people that the guys in hoods didn't approve of. But none of them had been killed. So he's here and witnesses an actual murder. And then he's spotted, so he takes off, and they start chasing him. And he manages to make it back to the hotel where he's staying, and he gets in and gets on the phone to call the FBI, and the vigilantes come in and corner him and demand to know what he saw. He says, I saw you murder that girl. And then they demand to know if he saw their leader's face, and he says he did not. Whereupon they beat him mercilessly until he is unconscious. Sam wakes up in a doctor's office, and there are 2 FBI agents there who say they had responded to his phone call. They want to know what he saw, and he tells them. They ask if he saw the leader's face, and to them he admits, yes, I saw his face clearly, at which point they shoot him dead. Because, well, the story implies that they are phony FBI men and phony doctors, and that all this was a trick to get to him and kill him. Although, one has to wonder if the implication might have been that they had those positions and were members of that vigilante group. Now, at the very end, there is a text box. This was a common thing in crime comics, and it had been for 10 years since the first Crime comics, Crime Doesn't Pay, with that Charles Bureau artwork that we talked about. The text at the end that explains the moral of the story. And so that was a common established tradition. But none of the other companies, certainly no one in the 1940s and no one else really in the early 50s, was making the kind of morals statement that Al Feldstein was making in these comics, and that Harvey Kurtzman was similarly making. So the killers say, now without a witness we'll be safe. And the narrator says, yes, safe. Safe behind their masks of prejudice, these hooded peddlers of racial, religious, and political hatred operate today. Mind you, they are shrewd and ruthless men such as those in our story. How long can we stay cool and indifferent to this threat to our democratic way of life? It is time to unveil these usurpers of our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms. Now, I want you to do two things. I want you to, number one, think about this story, just the story itself, in context of the other things that we've looked at from the 1930s and 40s, and recognize how much more complex this is than things that have appeared previously in comics. And then I want you to stop and think about the setting, the time period, 1952, and think about how bold it was to be making statements like this about essentially the American status quo. Well, if that seems like a bold move in the middle of the Cold War, at the end of the Korean War, well, take a look at this from an earlier issue, issue 2, a story written by Al Feldstein and illustrated by Jack Davis this time, although Wally Wood did the cover. So just take a look at the cover. Here's a crowd, an angry crowd, beating a guy. Give it to him, the dirty red. You don't like it here? Why don't you go back where you came from? And then a bystander is saying, stop it, please. What you're doing is wrong. Act like Americans. Now remember, this is not just a Cold War setting. This is the height of McCarthyism. Okay, so the name of the story is The Patriots, and it's set at a parade for returning Korean War veterans who are marching along, and all the people are cheering, and flags are waving and stuff like that. Well, the onlookers start to get a little ticked off at this guy down on the end, on the right. Now, he was there with his wife, and his wife had left, ducked out to go shopping, and he's there by himself. And they're ticked off at him because he's got like this sneer on his face. They don't like the way he looks. They don't like his expression. One of them says, look at his nose. He must be a foreigner. Now, let me ask you this. What kind of foreigner can you identify by their nose? Now, maybe you think that sounds silly, but what that really is implying is he must be Jewish. He must be one of those Jewish foreigners. Yeah, his skin's kind of dark too, and his hair. If you don't like it here, why don't you go back where he came from? Cut it out. Here comes the flag. And then they all look. The flag's coming by, and he's not taking off his hat. Why, that dirty. Not taking his hat off when the flag goes by, why, he must be a low-down, dirty, red communist. So, naturally, they beat him to death. And as they're wrapping up doing that, his wife shows up, horribly distraught, obviously because her husband is killed, and explains to them that he is a veteran who had been horribly injured and his face reconstructed, and so that's why he had that look on his face. And he was there because his old unit wanted to see him as they marched by. He didn't take off his hat because he was blind. Well, apparently, he's not the only one that was blind, right? One has to hope that there were some charges made here, but you never know because it was the 1950s. But the message is very, very clear. McCarthyism is un-American. Not many people were bold enough to say that in 1952. And finally, we'll look at this story from issue 3 that's called The Guilty. This is the one that I used the reprint for, and that's because, well, to be honest, it's because they bleep out the N-word in the 1990s reprint, which was not done in the 1952 original. In fact, many of you probably are too young to know this, but no one ever bleeped out the N-word in any media context before the 1990s. Anyway, let's take a look. By the way, the cover has nothing to do with this story. This wasn't the lead story. It's by Al Feldstein, art by Wally Wood. And by the way, the colorist on all these stories and most of the EC stories was Marie Severin, John Severin's sister that we mentioned once before. She just passed away not too long ago. She was the last surviving person who had worked at EC Comics. Anyway, so the story opens up and the police have arrested this black guy and they're bringing him into the jail, and an angry white mob is yelling and swearing at him and saying, "You'll get yours, black boy. If the law don't get you, we will." Then we find out, what's going on. What did he do? Killed a white woman, probably attacked her. And then the question is, well, what evidence is there? Someone saw him near the scene of the crime. So one person says that don't make him guilty, and another says it does in my book, and the sheriff's pretty set on it too. Then they're bringing the guy in here and put him in his cell, and someone remarks to the sheriff, "Don't you think we'd better lock the doors and protect him from the angry mob? They might try something." And the sheriff says, "Well, it would save the state a lot of money." "Oh, well, I guess you're right." So the sheriff is like, kind of halfway tempted just to let them take this guy and lynch him. However, the district attorney delivers some disturbing news to the sheriff. He informs him that even though everyone knows the black guy's guilty, because after all, he was seen somewhere in the vicinity, that they actually don't have much of a case. And that, in fact, there's a lawyer from some civil liberties organization coming to take his case. Those guys are pretty shrewd. They could get him off. And then word gets out about that, and the townspeople are terribly upset that some fancy lawyer is going to come in and get this guilty person freed. And so they go to the sheriff and say, all on circumstantial evidence, are we going to stand for that, sheriff, demanding he do something? And the sheriff says, "You should have lynched him when you had the chance. I can't do nothing now." So the lawyer shows up, makes his statement to the press that he is confident that the state has no case and confident that he can prove his client innocent at the trial. The sheriff gets all upset and he says, "No legal smart aleck from out of town is going to get him off, not while I'm sheriff." And then as the trial draws near, the district attorney, and I don't have this part on here, the district attorney warns the sheriff that the people are getting restless and it's a dangerous situation, and that the guy should be, the suspect should be moved to the county seat, to a different town where he'll be safe. So the sheriff, in the dead of night, transports, is going to move the prisoner. Puts him in there with a couple of deputies, puts him in the back of the car, and the sheriff reiterates that no blank loving lawyer is going to make a fool out of me. So they pick him up, force him in the car, and then the sheriff orders the deputy to stop the car. So the car is stopped, and the sheriff tells the suspect to run away. He says, "Now you're free. You can run." Well, the suspect isn't falling for that because he knows what's going on, and he refuses to run, and the sheriff essentially forces him to run and then shoots him in the back, shoots him dead, and, remarks to his deputies, "Did you not witness that attempted escape?" And they also are totally understanding of what's going on, and they're down with it. Then they pick up his body and bring him back, and as they're driving into town, the DA meets them and gives them now good news. The trial's off. You can let him go. But he's dead. I shot him while he was trying to escape. And the DA says, "Good Lord." Hank Barker, who, by the way, was the guy who saw the black guy in the vicinity, or who claimed he had seen him, Hank Barker just confessed. Anderson broke him down. He did it. He killed the woman. Collins was innocent as a baby. Well, too bad he attempted to escape. Wonder what caused him to try. And again, Feldstein has the final word with the moral. Whether Aubrey Collins was innocent or guilty is not important. But for any American to have so little regard for the life and rights of any other American is a debasement of the principles of the Constitution upon which our country is founded. Well, I would say that most parents in America at that time were foursquare in favor of their kids learning about the Constitution, but maybe not this way. Because again, this is the kind of stuff that was going on in America, that was going on all the time, that most of white America wanted to not be forced to look at and not be forced to think about. And now here's someone forcing their kids, not forcing, but encouraging their kids to think about it. So this story, like the others, really demonstrates, like I said, the complexity of some of these tales, and the fact that it really was laying a foundation for what EC Comics would continue to do afterward, which is to challenge the iniquities of the status quo. Now, some comics historians do find things to criticize about this story and some of the other stories that relate particularly to race. Did you notice that as I was recounting this story, even though the black guy had a name, Aubrey Collins, I never actually said it until the very end. I referred to him as the suspect or the guy or the black guy. And the point of my doing that is to demonstrate that even when Feldstein and also Kurtzman were writing these stories, these kind of Rod Serling-like morality plays, pointing out the injustices, the social injustices of America, and pointing to the plight of minorities, particularly African Americans, the African American characters rarely got a speaking role and rarely had any kind of development beyond just the fact that they were there and white people were oppressing them or witnessing the oppression of them and learning from it. So that is a valid criticism. It really is. But it doesn't take away from the fact that these guys were trying to introduce some controversial and complicated ideas to their readership, many of whom were younger. Comics historian Julian Chambliss has pointed out that although many parents in the early 50s expressed outrage and fury over the violence of EC's horror comics and crime comics, they may also, or perhaps some of them primarily, have been outraged by the fact that these types of questions were being put to their impressionable youngsters, and those impressionable youngsters were being potentially influenced by these comics editors, some of whom may have had foreign-looking noses, to question the way things were working in America. Well, be that as it may, no matter what the ultimate underlying cause, there was a building anger toward EC Comics and comics in general.